But today's conversation is part of a series that the Program for Latin American and Caribbean Studies has been running for a while on contemporary events in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so to kick it off, I'll turn things over to the director of that program, Jorge Coronado, and he can introduce the themes and the guests, and he'll also be running the show. Jorge.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for actually thinking about joining us up with the Global Lunchbox series. It's great. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak to more of our colleagues and the larger public. I want to just briefly thank our administrative staff for the wonderful work they're doing in setting this up. Actually, Danny Postal was instrumental in constructing this particular conversatorio. So I'm very grateful to him. All right, so today we're going to continue, as Ian said, our series on current events in Latin America. In the past, we've talked about Chile and Colombia, and today I'm delighted that we have two specialists of Brazil joining us. Brodwyn Fischer is professor of Latin American history and director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago. She is the author of many publications. I'm just going to note her two books: A Poverty of Rights, Citizenship and Inequality in 20th-Century Rio de Janeiro from 2008, and Cities from Scratch, Poverty and Informality in Urban Latin America. Rafael Ioris, who's also here, is Associate Professor of Latin American History at the University of Denver, and he is the author of Transforming Brazil, A History of National Development in the Post-War Era, as well as Frontiers of Development in the Amazon, Riches, Risks, and Resistances from this year. It's just about to appear, actually. The setup for this is we are going to have a conversation, a conversatorio, right, about current topics in Brazil, which I'll be leading for about 35 minutes, perhaps 40, depending on how we go. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. We'll be using the chat function because there's so many of us in Zoom. If you don't know how to do that, perhaps you could send a message to either Cindy Pingree or Danny Postal. They can tell you about it. Okay, let's get started. Brody, I'm going to start off with a question for you. Maybe you could tell us about a very hot topic right now, how Brazil is dealing with the current pandemic. Who are the relevant players? What's happening nationally, regionally, locally? Just give us a sort of overview, right, of what's happening right now.
Sure. So I just shared my screen. I hope everybody can see it. I put together some slides just to let everybody see a little bit what's there. So what I'm going to try to do really briefly is take you just through kind of the emergency situation as far as I understand it. And then I wanted to just say a few lines about how this fits into a larger history. And then also think a little bit about how, like it is everywhere, the pandemic is sort of exposing all kinds of levels of vulnerability within Brazilian society. And I hope that'll be kind of a segue for the next question for Rafael to talk about the current political situation. So I'll start with this chart. These are information that you can find on the Ministry of Health website. And I'll start by just saying that it's completely inaccurate. The best estimates that I've been able to see are that there may be about 12 times as many cases. That's just a shot in the dark figure, but judging from the difference between the number of deaths that are being reported and the averages from year to year, that's kind of what specialists are guessing. And so as of yesterday, these were the cases, 85,380 confirmed cases, and about 5,900 deaths, and 6.9% lethality. And you can see on the slide a little bit about how this is all working itself out regionally. And so you'll see that, not surprisingly, the most affected areas are the ones that are densest. So Rio, Sao Paulo, But there are also really significant pockets in Amazonas and in Ceará in the Northeast. And if I take you to the next slide, you can see kind of the trend, the number of cases per day, the number of deaths per day sort of going up. But just as is the case in the United States, it's really not very reliable because the testing is really poor, and especially in more vulnerable areas. These figures here actually are a little bit more useful in trying to understand how hard it's hitting different areas as far as the figures go. And the thing, basically what this is it lists the number of cases, the number of deaths, and then the incidencia is basically the number of deaths per I can't remember if I think it's per million or something, that are happening in different places. And the thing that's really striking here is that if you look at Amazonas and Amapá, as well as Pernambuco, and on this next little bit, Roraima, and they're almost as high as Sao Paulo and Rio, and I mean, they're higher, excuse me, than Sao Paulo and Rio. And so the places where you have the largest number of cases are not the places where you're having the largest incidence of cases. And that's really important to sort of understand in the geographical picture of the epidemic. So all of this is bad. It's made worse by the fact that the government response has been just a terrible mishmash, a disaster. Many of you might have seen this photograph, which was published in The Guardian. It's of mass graves in Manaus, which has been one of the worst hit places. And there was actually a huge controversy because they were actually trying to pile coffins up on top of each other in mass graves because they've just been hit so hard. With the number of deaths, they don't have any place to put people. And just to give an example, the first case in Manaus was on the 11th of March. Last Sunday, there were about 140 burials, and the average for a day is 30. And so that gives you some sense of the increase beyond the numbers that we can actually trace of cases. So it's been overwhelming. Most of the urgent care units are occupied in places like Sao Paulo, certainly in Manaus and Rio. There's really not a public health system that's really capable of even dealing with people that have access to hospitals. And then beyond that, there are so many people that just don't even have access to a regular public health post. And so it's a pretty desperate situation for people that are sick. And the government response has been, I guess, not too surprisingly for people that follow Brazil, pretty terrible. This is a really amazing chart that was put together by the Folha de Sao Paulo and published yesterday. And it's basically a timeline of the number of cases that Brazil has and the different things that President Jair Bolsonaro said in response to them. I can make this PowerPoint available to people if you want it later to read it more carefully. But the most recent one on the 28th of Brazil, when it was announced that Brazil had more deaths from coronavirus than China had, the response of the president was "E daí?" So what do you want me to do about it? Basically, I'm sorry. What do you want me to do? I may be Messias, but I can't make miracles. Was his kind of jocular response, and that's kind of typical of the attitude. He's been very eager to get everybody out on the street to say that isolation has been a failure, going against many members of his original coalition, and especially the governors of Rio and Sao Paulo state, against the measures that they put in place. And so it's just been a terrible mess of a response. Fired the health minister recently, which is part of a pattern of firing people that are not loyal to him. So in general, it's been a real mess of a response. And just I'll wrap up in a minute, but I just wanted to say a few words about sort of how this fits into a larger history of public health, and then a few words about special vulnerabilities. So into the larger history of public health, it's actually super interesting because, and I promise I'll do this very quickly. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the building of state capacity in Brazil, so in cities in the 19th century, and then at the national level in the 20th century, the reason that states developed capacities to interfere in and intervene and help in the kind of private world of social welfare actually had far more to do with public health than it had to do with anything else in Brazil. And so we can actually trace the origins of Brazil's national state both to the rural health crises that were really present in Brazil in the early 20th century, and actually to the Spanish flu crisis, which hit Brazil a little bit later than elsewhere, but hit pretty hard in 1918. And so there's this odd kind of situation where the very origins of the Brazilian national state and the overcoming of federalism go back to a public health crisis at the beginning of the century. And yet now in the beginning of the 21st century, we're seeing a national state that seems completely incapable of giving a concerted response to this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really brought home the fact that not just the most recent government, but actually many, many years of disinvestment in all kinds of public health, all kinds of well-being of the general population, all kinds of state capacity, all of that is just really coming home to roost with this crisis. And I heard a really interesting talk at the very beginning of the crisis that the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, which was actually part of that setting up of the public health infrastructure at the beginning of the 20th century, but they host these really wonderful roundtables. And the chefe de gabinete of the presidency of the Fiocruz Foundation had a way of describing this crisis that I thought was really interesting. He said, we need to think about it not so much as a crisis that is one crisis in Brazil. It's actually a bunch of crises that are happening at all different levels in all kinds of ways. And he described it as we need to look for the vulnerabilities within the vulnerabilities if we really want to understand what's going on here. And so I have a couple more slides to just show a little bit what he meant. So if you look, there's some very good maps with the data that we have from Sao Paulo. And this is a map of the places that have been worst impacted by the deaths, which is the most reliable of the numbers probably. And if you notice, the places in deep purple are the very worst affected places. And if you look at a map of the favelas of the shantytown communities in Sao Paulo, Black is the greatest density of favela communities. And so if you look at these side by side, you see that they don't line up exactly, but that the incidence is pretty close, especially in the places that are deep purple in one and Black on the other. And so that kind of map really gives us a sense that even within a single city, there's such enormous variation in terms of how people are being hit by this crisis. And in Brazil, as elsewhere within cities, the people that are hit the worst are the ones that live in crowded conditions, can't stop working, don't have the option of social isolation, and who have virtually no good access to any kind of healthcare. And so when they do get sick, their rates of death are a lot higher. And we can see this in Rio. This is a general map of the incidence of cases in Rio and the geography of the city. But then if we go on to some research that's actually being carried out by people in the communities themselves, you can see like the various favelas that have recorded cases. This was as of a couple of days ago. And then if you look at this chart, you can see the death rate compared to the number of reported cases. And what this is suggesting is that in favelas in general, but especially in a couple of the largest favela complexes in Rio, the incidence of deaths is a lot higher. So it's not just that they're vulnerable to the disease, it's also that the mortality rates are a lot higher. And that's certainly been the case in the Amazon region. And so, the vulnerability, particularly of indigenous people to this, has been a horrible tragedy because the disease is being brought, like it has historically so many times, by invaders. And so you think of, you know, the Portuguese colonizers who came and brought smallpox, or you can think of all of the epidemic diseases that were brought, you know, throughout the 19th century and the 20th century as people from the southeast of Brazil started to go into the interior, or even the measles that probably killed about 15% of the population of the Amazon region between the 60s and the 80s with the gold rush. There's a long history of diseases being brought to that region, and indigenous people are especially vulnerable to all of this. So there's this idea that what this is exposing is really the vulnerability of different populations. And as I'm sure Rafael will talk about in a few minutes, it's also exposing vulnerabilities at the level of the national state, at the level of local governance, the disinvestment in basic sanitation, basic hygiene, the lack of access to water and sewage and draining, but also the general lack of faith in the government, the general lack of trust in public information. There are just all of these levels of vulnerability that are coming out with this crisis. And I think that many people in Brazil are worried that this is in the end going to be one of the worst cases of the epidemic in the world, simply because the response has been so fragmented, so contradictory, and so unable to go through things.
Thanks so much, Brody, for that. And actually, that really helpfully brings us to another way of kind of framing this, right? Which is precisely in terms of that field response. I think, it would be helpful, Rafael, for you to tell us a little bit more about how we got here. What Brody's spoken in a large historical framework. Perhaps you could go a little bit more deeply into the recent history, especially after 2010, right, and Lula's departure. What are the factors that have led us to this point?
Sure. I need to click the share screen or no? I do, all right. Okay. So I don't know if you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
So let's see here. So I just want to, that was a great introduction. I'll get a little bit to the background of how we got here. I just want to highlight again, we are in a situation that specifically now, more recently, has been defined by this gentleman, right? The president of Brazil, as you can see, being led by someone that at least would be a case of the blind leading, right, the country. He's someone who has called this gripezinha, which would be a small flu. So he's been really one of the main characters, political leaders in the world, minimizing and denying the situation here. And I just want to go highlight a few of the economic numbers that we have here, right? In terms of the numbers of cases, Brody highlight that very well. I just want to highlight, what's the expectation for the economic impact here. If people can see, the unemployment, where we are now and what's estimated, right? So we will indeed be a profound health crisis, as well as social and economic. And highlight just to one more point here, the impact, of course, will have a zip code, as Brody highlighted there in the slums. So people will be impacted here differently. After being reluctant to do this, they passed in Congress some sort of a stipend for people, but as you can see, it's very minimal. And the absurdity is that in the beginning, at least, people would have to download an app on their cell phone to be able to access that stipend, right? So as you can see, people are not really thinking of the most impacted people here. So, but how did we get here, right? We need to go back to the early 2000s when Brazil and much of Latin America was surfing a little bit on the commodity boom. So they were able really to, Latin America has historically been an area of production of commodity for the global markets. That continues to be the case even in the countries that achieved some level of industrialization, such as Brazil in the second half of the 20th century. And Brazil actually deindustrialized in this process, right? And it really, in the last couple of decades, has really surfed on the commodity boom. Interestingly, in the case of Brazil, more than anywhere else in the region, also that led to a reduction of absolute poverty, as you can see on the graph on the right there. That was done by different instruments, but I want to highlight a couple, which would be this monthly stipend to poor families, which is called the Bolsa Familia, right, as you have there on the left, and also unprecedented increases in the minimum wage. So Brazil really witnessed this situation where absolute poverty was being reduced significantly in the mid 2000s to the late, 2010, 2012, and then we start seeing a decrease on that. Along with a narrative which was built and warrantedly in some ways, but also built by conservative forces in Brazil, the media and business groups. Starting in 2014, 15, people started, especially middle classes, upper middle classes and business groups, taking to the streets. Not surprisingly, as we saw in the United States as well, what it says here on the left is, I want my country back, right? We've seen that before. People went to the streets demanding an end of the rule of the Workers' Party, which had been in power from 2003 and was still in power in 2015. A woman, Dilma Rousseff, had been elected in 2014, and people really were refusing to accept those results. So they took to the streets and demand, right, that the Labour Party would come out of power. There was an impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016. And along with this anti-establishment rhetoric, right, narrative, which discredited much of the political parties, majority of the political leaders, we start seeing this process aligned with very conservative forces, business groups, and a new political force in Brazil, which is the evangelical vote. So this is one of the mega churches in Brazil, right? That really in the last few years amounted to this broad, I would call a little Frankenstein coalition, right? Of very conservative, culturally conservative groups of people, as well as neoliberal business sectors and very conservative political forces that amounts to producing, you know, the election of Bolsonaro, the gentleman we saw there before, being blinded by the mask, which was a conservative politician for a long time. He was a retired military man, forcefully retired, but in a long time congressperson, which means he was an insider, but who rebranded himself and reinvented himself as this sort of this, along with this narrative of being an outsider, and was able to amass and become this vessel for this right-wing / neoliberal anti-establishment and military coalition, right? Who is in power now in Brazil. So that's what we have today. We have the situation where we have an unprecedented level of military members in the government. We have a political agenda which is defined by neoliberal policies of dismantling state capacity and reducing the social programs and policies that have been put in place in Brazil in the last 20, 25, 30 years. Questioning the merits of the redemocratization process in Brazil, which has been taking place also in the last 30 years, has a very strong sort of anti-political correctness, right? Cultural moralism, conservative values, and that's what we have in power in today here. A government that denies science, has denied the severity of the COVID, has denied the role of the state in state capacity, state institutions to do something about this. And so I corroborate what Brody said before, that this has the elements of really becoming one of the hardest challenges and crises in the social, in the health, in the economic, and in the political, right, dimension in Brazil. And that's what's unfolding there today. The world is paying attention, and I can go back a little bit more into the details of where we are specifically in terms of the political institutions and what could be done perhaps with the situation.
Thank you, Rafael. I wanted to come back to Brody to speak a little bit about what we're all seeing in the news. I mean, my inbox is full of news on Brazil every day, and a lot of it is around criminality, right? Especially coming out of the government. So I wanted you to tell us about the role that violence and criminality have played over the last few years, perhaps are playing right now in the country.
Sure. So I'm gonna take back the PowerPoint to get to mine. 1 second. Is it come up? Did it come up now, Jorge?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm actually, if you don't mind, I would like to maybe take a little bit wider lens than you suggested on this, because I think one thing that we all read about in Brazil is, kind of the city of God vision of violence in Brazil, right? So this idea that there are armed people, and especially in the favelas, and that there's a lot of crime, this sort of idea of that kind of violence. And I'd like to take a step back and actually frame it more in terms of the idea of parallel power, which I think might be a slightly deeper way to get into these issues and the way that they connect actually both to COVID and to the present political crisis. So I wanted to take sort of three angles, and I'll start by just sort of explaining what it is that I mean by political power, by parallel power, and what the different levels of that are in Brazil, and then talk a little bit about the connections between Bolsonaro and this kind of violence. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about how parallel power is actually helping a little bit in the COVID crisis, which is sort of an interesting, and I guess not unexpected if you're from Brazil, but unexpected from an international perspective. So parallel power is something that exists everywhere in every society all the time. It's just any form of power that is not invested in the state is essentially what you can think of it as. And so obviously it's not something that's unique to Brazil. It's not exotic. It's not, it's not something special. But Brazil has a particular relationship with it that sort of started in the 19th century when in 1831, the slave trade was declared illegal. And then in the following decades, slaves were imported to Brazil at a faster pace than they ever had been before. And so the idea that a state makes something illegal and then facilitates the violation of its own laws in order to perpetuate a particularly brutal form of labor relations is kind of a good founding moment for parallel power in Brazil. So there's always been this kind of duality there. But in the years since democratization, there's been a really interesting sort of parallel between, on the one hand, the growth of citizenship in the way that Rafael just mentioned, but on the other hand, the growth of all kinds of forms of parallel power. And so some of these are sort of benign and in fact progressive. So you have things like neighborhood organizations that take over what the state doesn't do at a neighborhood level in poor communities. You have NGOs, or you have local charitable organizations that just kind of step in and organize things when there's no state there to do it. So those kinds of things are generally understood as being positive. But as you go from there, you end up with all kinds of other forms of parallel power that end up at the other end of the spectrum with things like drug gangs and militias. And most of those, by now, most of the drug gangs have actually morphed into criminal organizations that are also responsible for arms trafficking, that have the capacity to really sort of set down the rule of law in the communities where they develop. And at the absolute extreme of this, you have these things that are called militias or milicias, which were developed in the 1990s supposedly as a response to drug traffickers, but very quickly became these essentially mafia organizations that do things like paid assassinations and extortions, and they do all kinds of crooked real estate deals. They grab land. I mean, just all kinds of criminal activity that's managed by these militias. And what's interesting about them is that a lot of them are made up of people who used to be in the police forces. So there's this kind of connection, direct connection between the militias and the state. So all of this has gone to the point where a lot of anthropologists and sociologists who are writing about this now talk about large parts of Brazil actually being governed by competitive normative systems. And so you have the law of the state, and then you have the law of the traffickers or of the illegal activity, some of which, as in the case of the PCC in Sao Paulo, is actually respected more by locals than the police are. And so there's, all kinds of unexpected things there. And then there's the normative regime of the church, and especially evangelical religion. And then there are normative regimes that come from NGOs and from world organizations. So there are all these sort of competing sources of power and structure and infrastructure and resources that, if we think about how Brazil is governed right now, we have to kind of take all of them into account. And in the current crisis, there are two things about this that are especially important. The first one is that Jair Bolsonaro has been directly connected to the militias that I was talking about for a few minutes. So this chart, I can't say for sure whether all the information on here is absolutely certain. Part of the problem in Brazil right now is that there's a general kind of lack of information, lack of verifiable information. But as far as I've read, I think that what's here is true. And what you see if you go through the very complex chart here is a set of connections that link Jair Bolsonaro through his son, Flavio Bolsonaro, and through one of the advisors or ex-advisors, Fabrício Queiroz, link them actually to the assassination of Marielle Franco, which was a very important event that happened in Brazil. She was a Black city councilwoman who stood for the most progressive wing of real politics in terms of sexuality and race and equal rights for everybody. And she and her driver were simply gunned down by militia members who have been connected through these complicated networks to Jair Bolsonaro. And the history of the Bolsonaro family goes back to the beginning with the militias, because a lot of his original electoral support in the west zone of Rio comes back to these militias. They became political organizations, much like the mafia has been at different points. And so he has these connections that go all the way through to his presidency. And it explains a lot about his way of governance, because a lot of the things that he's been doing at the level of sort of reconstructing the state have actually involved pulling out what we might call in the United States the deep state, and replacing it by people who have all kinds of connections to these forms of parallel power that are centered on the police and on the militias. This is especially true in the Amazon. It's especially true in regard to the recent controversies. Just this last week, there was a big controversy about the administrators of justice at the national level. Somebody was kicked out. There was a very controversial suggestion for replacement that was then denied. And all of this is connected to investigations into the family of Bolsonaro and his collections with the militias. And so this is right at the center of politics right now. And what happens in the country is going to depend a lot on what happens to these investigations. And Sergio Moro, who resigned last week, most people probably know who he is. He's the sort of judge that was responsible in some ways for setting off the whole political crisis. He resigned supposedly because he didn't want meddling in the federal police. But there have also been a lot of accusations that he's protected Flavio Bolsonaro. So it's a very complicated set of events there. The only last thing that I wanted to say quickly, I'll unshare this screen and share a different screen with you, is I just wanted to call attention, so as not to be completely negative, to what is happening in a positive way in terms of these informal sources of power. And I'm not sure if that, the screen share, did it work? Can you see my Regis de Maré, the yellow screen there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We can see it.
So I'm not going to go through all these because it would take too much time, but what I wanted to point out is that both at the level of cities, so this is a website that you can go to at the University of Sao Paulo that just has this long list of these sort of extra governmental associations that are trying to do something about the COVID crisis. And it's actually incredibly impressive. They're mobilizing, people to do everything from provide income from people who have lost it to healthcare and masks and food, assistance for people who are drug addicts. I mean, it's just an incredible array of social services that are being provided by communities that have learned how to organize themselves. And so there's a lot of social action that's happening here. If you check this out, there's a version in English and you can kind of go through and look at that. There's a much more high profile. CUFA is the Centro Único of the Favelas. It's a 1990s organization, but they've gotten all kinds of musicians and put together a really important funding drive for people who are destitute in the middle of this crisis. So at that level, you can go and see what's going on. And then really local organizations like the one in the Maré Favela complex in Rio, which has about 140,000 people who live in favela conditions in this complex of communities. And they have this incredibly well-organized campaign to get out food to everybody, to check on people, to get out hygiene items that people can't buy, to educate people about what to do in a way that the government's not able to do. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the fact that parallel power sometimes has a really good impact. It doesn't solve the problem that the state is absent, but these are people that if anybody's looking for a direct way to help in these situations, these are all really great places to go and figure out how we can have an impact on the situation instead of just talking about it. So,
thank you so much, Brodie. That's wonderful information. I was thinking about what you were just saying in terms of Bolsonaro's kind of taking over of the Brazilian state, right, with criminal elements, and I was wondering, in terms of opposition, in terms of political opposition, right, within the government, but maybe also outside the government, is a possibility to think about. Rafael, what do we know about that opposition? Is it effective? What sorts of ways is it organizing itself to defend, right, against Bolsonaro's initiatives?
Sure. So let me go back here. So I just want to mention that, are you seeing my screen?
not yet.
No, not yet.
Let's see. What do I need to do? Let's see.
Usually it's at the top, share screen function.
Hold on.
or at the bottom, depending on what.
Yeah, I have to share every time. Okay, sorry. So,
Yeah.
so Bolsonaro, let me go to this slide here. Let's see if that works. Okay, can you see that one?
Yes.
Okay, so Bolsonaro was someone, again, who comes to power with an anti-establishment narrative, right? Was able to amass this coalition, which is sort of an anti-coalition, right? The main drive of many people who ended up voting for Bolsonaro was the anti-vote, anti-workers' party vote, anti-corruption, anti-establishment, anti-political correctness, anti-social programs, right? So it was important for him to again, as in this rebranding effort, right, to become this vessel for all these different demands, to claim that he was not only an outsider, but that he would govern himself, that he would control the country and he would lead the country forward. So he never really tried to have a lot of support in Congress. Interestingly, for a while, it sort of worked. Several bills that were important for the government ended up passing, but in spite of Bolsonaro's style, because they represented a little bit of the conservative agenda, such as labor reform, the pension reforms. So in many ways, Bolsonaro always was this sort of single leader who claims to speak directly to the people. So not really wanting to work through the institutions, but rather try to destroy the institutions. That situation has gotten worse more recently for different reasons, right? We see here the pictures, let me highlight here with my arrow, right? We have three governors here, Flávio Dino in Maranhão, João Dória in São Paulo, and Witzel here in Rio. They have become very important in this movement, which has some echoes in the United States, where in lack of the federal government support for things, right, governors took matters in their own hands. Some of these leaders here, Dória and Witzel in Rio, they actually were aligned with Bolsonaro. They were elected along with Bolsonaro's agenda, but now they have become almost like enemies, and Bolsonaro has gone after them with his direct support on the streets, right? So they have become this new response tied to the state government. So Bolsonaro is increasingly isolated, and that has rapidly, happened in the last, month and a half. He's increasingly isolated. We see in Brazil now a little bit of a crisis, right, of the federal system, in the sense that the federal government is working against state governors who are mostly leading the effort, right, for social isolation, for a little bit of social programs, trying to prevent the opening of the stores. Major city business groups that still tied to Bolsonaro were pushing for opening, commerce and stores and getting people back to work and back to the streets. So we've seen a lot of that. So Bolsonaro is increasingly isolated. We see this situation. I want to see if I can, let me see if I can get this slide here. In the center here, we have the Supreme Court of Brazil. This is the Speaker of the House, and this is the leader of the National Bar Association Brazil, which is a very powerful organization. It's an organization that has the legal right to actually petition for an impeachment process by the Constitution, right? This Bar Association has that right to petition the chamber to start the process of impeachment. So in addition to the isolation and this fight with the governors, he's seeing opposition coming straight from the Speaker of the House, who has become also a little bit of an enemy of these protests, right, supporting Bolsonaro, and members of the Supreme Court too. The Supreme Court has become a little more active in this process. It has become active in the last several years in Brazil in many different ways. We've seen a process of judicialization of the political arena. In this sense here, in the last few weeks, it actually has granted the rights. Bolsonaro said that the governors did not have the right to demand physical isolation, social isolation, and the federal court granted and assured that the governors had that right. Again, has some echoes of what situation here happening in the United States. The Supreme Court has become also more active in the last couple of weeks, actually even last week, when the Attorney General's office, who is appointed by Bolsonaro, and he's really walking this fine line, trying to be loyal to Bolsonaro, but having to do what the law demands and what the Supreme Court now demands of him, to open two investigations, one into who has been leading these demonstrations against the social isolation, the one that Bolsonaro has gone to, right? Let me go back to the Gripezinha slide, right? He has seen all these people on the streets, right? He has met people on the streets here, and the Supreme Attorney's Office opened this investigation to see who is behind organizing this, which would be an illegal activity, because there's the law to demand social isolation. And now the attorney's office also has started an investigation into Sergio Moro's accusation last week of Bolsonaro's political intervention into the federal police. So we do see in general this mobilization by the National Bar Association, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General's office. The Speaker of the House is in this very tricky situation too. He has been aligned with Bolsonaro in many bills. He has led this effort to pass the labor reforms, the pension reforms, which were key to not only Bolsonaro, but primarily to his Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes, who is a very strong neoliberal economist. So we've seen this mobilization, this increased isolation of Bolsonaro, and increasingly a situation where we have a government that also had central figures in power, right? The military has seen even more now the role of the military in government. We see here in the picture the two of the key generals in power in Brazil. Brazil, out of the 22 cabinet members, we have 8, right, superior officers, generals in power. Brazil has now more military retired and active members in power than Venezuela, Maduro's regime, and echoing, the regime, the presence of military leaders in power in the dictatorship, right, from 64 to 85. The question in Brazil now has been, are we going to, the military increased effort and presence in government are going to tame Bolsonaro, or are they going to kick Bolsonaro out? There would be some sort of coup taking place in Brazil. There has been a lot of speculation in this. What I would say is that so far, though we see more and more military figures, especially Braga Neto, this gentleman right here, in power in Brazil, leading the government now, having been a more assertive role, Bolsonaro has been able to control their presence and almost having the upper hand in the sense that he still goes to the streets and meets with his supporters and demonstrators, something that Braga Neto supposedly, right, would not in favor and try to block him from doing so. And additionally, the military are very aligned in many ways with Bolsonaro in his own agenda. Maybe they don't like his style. They would rather have him to be a little more tamed, a little more restrained, but in a situation that seems to be convenient to both of them. The military generals are back in power in the legal, right, legally legitimate way. We saw without a military coup, and so that's where we are today. I can go into the legal options that we would have in the country. I can do it now or later, Jorge.
Why don't we, Rafael, thank you for that. Why don't we start to segue?
Yeah.
I've got some questions already queued up, and I think here either of you can jump in. It's an indicator of both of your, Rafael and Brody, your coherence and your erudition, that it's 12:45, and I barely noticed that much time had gone by. So we do need to get to the Q&A. I'm going to read these out to everyone, and you can send me on the chat function, or actually send everyone on the chat function the questions, and we'll try to get through them. So. This is from our own Danny Postel. He says, Rafael mentioned the cultural turn on the Brazilian right, the emphasis on religion, family, and sexuality. Fernando Haddad, the former mayor of Sao Paulo, who lost the election to Bolsonaro, has remarked that everyone talks about fake news, but in Brazil, we have a fake country, meaning rumors, paranoid thinking, and conspiracy theories that have become persuasive. Brazil is hardly alone in this regard. We see it in Hungary, we see it in India and the Philippines, and of course the US. How do you explain this phenomenon in Brazil, and how deep and intense is Bolsonaro's support? This can go to either of you. Brody, you're muted, I think. Rafael?
Sure.
Rafael's screen, maybe he could...
Yeah.
Oh, right, Rafael. Maybe you could just unshare that, or maybe I can?
Yeah, you can do that, I guess. Well, stop share. I can do it. Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Oh, the power. Look at that. I did it.
You're amazing. But,
I mean, I would say, just quickly, and then you can jump in, Brody. This cultural turn, I think that's an interesting phrasing, Danny. Thank you. It really, I mean, you define and you describe it very well in what's happening. I would say it's one of the more challenging elements of this whole transition, in the sense to understand how quickly and how broad, right, supporters for this conspiracy theories, including along the, not only in terms of a political sense and anti-establishment and anti-political correctness or social programs and many of the policies that have been put in place in the early 2000s in Brazil, but in the sense to really the election of Bolsonaro was mired into fake news, you know, of all types, you know, claiming that if Fernando Haddad had been elected, he would be kidnapping children to these camps where they would implement sex change operations on them, right? All this type of absolutely crazy ideas that were shared in the hundreds of thousands, you know, of dozens of thousands of times by people in Brazil of all segments, right? Yes, the middle classes were leading this anti-Labor Party time in power in many ways, but by the time of the election of Bolsonaro, it really had found support along, especially big city, suburban, lower social economic segments. And so it really has reshaped the conversation in Brazil. There's this strong sense that science, of course, is questionable, that the universities are there to indoctrinate people, and we have to tame and control them. Bolsonaro has as one of these important influential gurus, right, this gentleman called Olavo de Carvalho, who lives in the suburb in Virginia, suburbs of Richmond, but who has a blog and has really become this indoctrinator of many of the elements of the Bolsonaro family and other people in power, such as even the foreign minister of Brazil, has this idea that COVID is an element of this China conspiracy, and that Brazil is being attacked by the world, and the only way to respond is with the sort of right-wing populist leader that is going to rescue and save us, right? We'll see what the numbers of the COVID impact will have in Brazil, to see if that will lead to a little bit of an erosion and distrust of this narrative being fostered and disseminated by Bolsonaro himself, his sons, and the government. But that's where we are. So I would, Brody, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rafael. A lot of the things that you said were things that I won't go back and repeat, but I want to think about like what it is that we would mean by saying that there's been a cultural turn in Brazil, because I think that there are actually a bunch of different levels that we can think about it. And so one is certainly, you know, that there's been a rise in the evangelical voting population and evangelical religious people as well. But there's also, very importantly, a kind of older strand of Catholic conservatism that has actually found a lot of expression in the last couple of years as well. And so I think that kind of religious core may in some ways be the most important manifestation of this sort of cultural turn in Brazil in the last 20 years. And a lot of it is in reaction to the really quick rate of cultural change that, you know, I and most of the people that I know think is really positive, but that they find deeply troubling, deeply offensive. And I think that there hasn't been a way in Brazil for a conversation to happen between those two sides in such a way that any common ground can be found. And so you have these kind of parallel universes of morality and information and understanding. And no matter which side you're on, it's almost impossible to see why the other side feels the way that they do. And so, you know, I have my personal feelings about which side is right and which side is wrong, but I think the deeper problem is that there is this kind of chord that was being struck, not just by what Bolsonaro said in his campaign and things that to me were incredibly offensive, what Rafael mentioned, and also a lot of racial language and the rest. But it wasn't just what he said, it was also this process of recognition that these are people who deserve to be talked to in the public sphere, and this sense of respect, right? And again, it's hard for me to see because that's not the politics that I share, but I think that for a lot of people, much less than any specific policy, what they were voting for in Bolsonaro was an attitude, a feeling, a way of seeing the world that they believed that they could recognize at some level, despite all of the ridiculous things that he said. And to me, the question going forward in terms of politics has to do with what is the response from the progressive wing to that dimension of what's happened politically in Brazil. You know, how is it that, because you're talking about a really large percentage of the electorate, and these are not people who are neoliberal, it's not the Guedes wing, it's not even the Centrão, the kind of, you know, Sao Paulo Paulo-based center of the political spectrum, these are people who oftentimes live in areas that were really benefited by the Lula years, people who received the Bolsa Familia, the family payments. They had every reason to be enthusiastic about the Lula governments, and yet there was something that didn't jive. And part of it has to do with this question of morality, or that they understand as morality. And part of it also has to do with the question of violence. And the very fact that Jair Bolsonaro is part of this militia movement, it gives voice to a language that a lot of people share of just frustration with not having a government that seems to be able to control anything. And some people, I think, from the left, they think that if you go back and you analyze the PT years, there were so many wonderful things that were done, but that the failure to really address the growth of extra-legal governance, the growth of criminal gangs, the expansion of these kind of parallel regimes, a lot of people think that that may be one of the real errors of the PT government that opened up the way for, you know, this incredibly fascist way of seeing the world to kind of come to center stage. And so I think that in the long run, the sooner that progressive forces in Brazil can grapple with those issues in a real way and put them at the center of the political stage, then the more steps we're going to have to be able to go forward.
Brody, thank you, Rafael and Brody, for that response. And I just wanted to say that there are obviously so many differences, but it's kind of like being in an echo chamber and thinking about the U.S. recent context, right? And that's a topic for another conversatorio and for a much longer conversation. Larry Marks has sent on a question. The presentations by Professor Fischer and Ioris are incredibly clear and scary. Agreed. They describe a national government that is unable or unwilling to govern for the benefit of citizens. This weakness is made obvious by the government's failure to respond to the pandemic. Are there social and historical trends that could justify a sense of optimism? The fact that parallel forms of governance can work effectively locally does not present a solution. It is another manifestation of government incompetence. Where can the country and we as observers look to find hope?
Okay, if I could start?
Go ahead.
So I can just share here. I just want to show a couple of slides which I think would be important in this, which is a little bit of institutional side of things. Is this being shared?
Yes.
Okay. A little bit of the institutional side, and then try to get to the where do we have sense of optimism. So the question of Brazil today, the political, conversation is, of course, what can be done, and if it's how we would find a legitimate legal way to address not only the COVID situation, but Bolsonaro, who has by sort of not consensual, of course, but by many growing numbers of people seen as a government that it can't last, right? It's basically destroying, right, institutions of the state rather than doing things. And COVID is revealing, much more forcefully the situation. There's a lot of conversation about what could be done in a legal sense, especially in ways of removing, right, Bolsonaro in power, which would be, I guess, a little bit tied to the optimist sense. Is it institutionally viable, right, to address the situation of Bolsonaro today? So we have an attempt which was pursued a little bit of trying to tame Bolsonaro, make him almost like a Queen of England situation, which is, he will be there, but he doesn't govern, right? And the actors who will basically do this seem to be rational actors and more tame. The nationalist in inspiration would be these military leaders in power. That hasn't really worked thus far, right? We do have this understanding that the election of Bolsonaro was mired in fake news scandals and illegal proceedings and actions of his campaign. That has been filed, suits in the electoral courts, and they could, cancel the election. We don't really expect that they will act along those ways yet. We have this idea that one way to sort of deal with the dilemma and the paralysis where we are today, right, which be not from the sort of democratic forces in the country, but from Bolsonaro, which would be this autogolpe, right, which would be he would close the system and he would become this military leader. We don't see that as very likely in the sense that thus far, though there has been a lot of speculations, the military actors haven't really signaled that they could do that. So let's get to the two actual legal proceedings, which would be the impeachment and the common crime. And there are bases for both of them, right? The Speaker of the House is sitting on about 30 requests for impeachment in the chamber in Brazil today. And we'll see what could be done there. And the other proceeding would be through the Supreme Court in the Attorney's Office by indicting Bolsonaro in common crimes such as joining protesters in the streets while perhaps he had COVID himself. He's refusing to reveal his test of the COVID. He might be forced to do now in the next 2 days. There's a judge who is forcing him to reveal that, but we don't have indication of that yet. So that's where we are today. Both the impeachment and the common crimes would have to go through the House. And that's why he's been working of trying to buttress support in the House now. And what we have today, and that's what I want to highlight here, is the country is not equally divided, but we don't seem to have strong support yet in the country to see that any sort of removal would take place. So in many ways, the COVID situation revealed problems. So there's much more to be seen this in terms of not being very optimistic about things, right? It reveals the shortcomings of this destruction of the state policies, the neoliberal policies being put in place in the last several years, including before Bolsonaro, under Temer, right? Since from 2016 onwards. The COVID situation, which is likely to grow, the top of the curve in most of the bigger cities are still to come in the next couple of weeks, expected. So we have a lot of this reality to be very disheartened about. So where could a hope come in this situation? That's why I asked it here, people power, and Brody highlighted that before, right? In the slums, in the lower income neighborhoods, a lot of people are mobilizing. A lot of people are doing the food delivery help, right, to people in their houses that cannot come out. People are trying to spread actual useful information, right, in this situation, such as Rádio Maré, right, this big complex of favelas in Rio. They're trying to spread news, what you need to be doing. If you need to go out, wear masks, try to stay home, all these different things, because the government, of course, is trying to sabotage a lot of that situation. So where do we see maybe signs of hope? I would say a little bit in the situation of the work being done by some of the governors. Some of the governors are really taking matters, right, and including buying respirators from China in some clever ways that the federal government cannot stop those purchases by triangulating the shipments through, I think, Ethiopia instead of coming straight into Sao Paulo. And some of these things have been blocked by the customs service by Bolsonaro, and then they were eventually delivered to the States. So we find a little bit of signs of hope and action in grassroots mobilization. We find a little bit in what the governors are doing. But I would say that we see today I would say one of the strongest challenges and crisis of the Brazilian democracy today. It didn't start with Bolsonaro. It didn't start with COVID. But it really is challenging the situation. We are in a political paralysis. Bolsonaro doesn't seem to be able to govern much of the country, but the opposition doesn't have enough power yet to do things. Of course, this is very fluid. This is really moving. Things could change in the next few weeks. Maybe not necessarily in the way that I would like to see, which would be more in terms of the political forces, democratic forces in the country, but would have to require, the Supreme Court to act more forcefully. And there's a lot of conversation to be had about that. But in a way, I'm trying to see the whole idea of crisis as an opportunity, right? But it could also be an opportunity amidst the strongest challenges and dilemma and the paralysis of democracy in Brazil today. It could revive experiences that in the past brought together democratic forces from the left, from the center, and even from the right. That was the case when transition from the dictatorship in the late 70s, early 80s. That was the case in the early 90s when we impeached the presidents, right, mired in corruption. So it could be an opportunity. We'll see what happens. Today, it's International Workers' Day, and it's Labor Day in Brazil, right? It's Dia do Trabalho, and people are trying to create this sort of national front in support of democracy. Leaders from the right and from the left are trying to get together today for the first time virtually, but nonetheless, right, to start a conversation about rebuilding Brazilian democracy, which again has seen challenges and problems for the last several years, but now in a much more intense, in a much more violent way in many ways. And amidst one of the worst crises, economic, social, political, health crisis in the history of the country, hopefully these democratic forces can find common ground and can find dialogue, establish dialogue, which is missing. still today, but can revive an opportunity for dialogue and work together to do something. But that's all I have in the sense to try to find optimism.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for that. Brody, would you like to address this question about hope?
Yeah, maybe we can get the screen so I can see who's up.
Yes. Let's see.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, again, maybe I want to take just a step back from because I think there are a couple different questions. I mean, one is, will the Bolsonaro government itself end and be replaced by something else soon? And I think Rafael did a lovely job of going through the different ways that could happen, and especially highlighting the importance of the judicial branch and of the military as being probably the groups of actors that have the most cards in their hands at this point. And so that immediate question is interesting because it's, you know, in a way, the hope for change is in the hands of some of the people that that began this crisis to start with, that is in the judicial branch, and then with the military, which of course oversaw a terrible dictatorship for years in Brazil. And so in a way, to try to find hope in those two places is a strange mix. Although, of course, there are lots of judicial activists that have done incredible work to try to extend the rule of law and make it more progressive in the last many years. So, but anyway, so I share that view about the short-term prospects. But I think that, I mean, at other moments of really historical and progressive transition in Brazil, there are a couple of elements that I think we're having a really difficult time seeing in place right now. I mean, one is that in the past, as in the United States, there used to be sources of information that were trusted by a wider range of people. I mean, I remember first going to Rio and being just amazed. I would go out when everybody else knew that they shouldn't because there was something to watch on TV. So it would be a novella, it would be a football game or whatever. And I didn't know anything about Brazil, so I would go out in the streets and I would look at the buildings and all of the lights in every single window would flicker at the same time. Right? The sense that everybody was watching the same thing at the same time. This happened also with radio in the 30s and 40s, this sort of sense that there was some source of information that people trusted. And I don't think we can exaggerate the importance that it's not just something on the right. Nobody trusts information from anywhere. And so people have sort of, instead of reading the papers, they go into their WhatsApp groups, you know, or they go to Twitter, and it ends up being these closed conversations where the same meme or the same idea is repeated over and over again, but nobody really knows any way to judge whether the information is good or not, except for who it's coming from. So I think that there's a problem with information and people's confidence in the systems that actually deliver information to the world. And, you know, how it is that people who are in the world communications and academia and writing and newspapers, how it is that gets refocused and how it is that you could end up with a source of information that's trusted by both sides, I think is a really big question. Then there's a question of trust for institutions. And so in previous health crises, it was strong institutions that came in and sort of began to figure out a way out of the crisis, oftentimes in pretty authoritarian ways. But there was the example of the AIDS crisis, where the very best of what a Brazilian public health crisis could do came out in that and became a model for the world. And again, there's the problem of a lack of trust, not just in the ability of institutions to run, but also in the strength of institutions vis-a-vis all these other forms of parallel power. And so, and even NGOs go into this game. You know, do you put your eggs in that basket? Do you put your eggs in the basket of the government? Do they always cooperate with each other? It's just this incredibly complex institutional front. And so I think that whatever work can be done to strengthen institutions and again, create something that everyone can trust rather than, you know, something that's constantly contested. So I think the media, I think this question of trust, and finally just this question of both sides of the political spectrum trying to find a way to talk with the new political conjuncture that's out there. I mean, Brazil is different now than it was in '88, and the interests that are going to create a coalition that can actually occupy and become a kind of solid force and enduring force in Brazilian politics, they've really changed. And I noticed this a lot in the iconography of the 2018 election. If you looked at the programs that each major candidate put forward, so Haddad on the one side and Bolsonaro on the other, one thing that was really incredible was Haddad is an amazing policy thinker. And, you know, his gestão in Sao Paulo, if you look at the city plan and you look at the way that he was thinking through different policies, it's incredibly impressive. And you know, urbanists have said so. I mean, I don't think there's any questioning his credentials as a policymaker, but his communication was straight out of 1988. And it was dense, it was full of complex language, it was difficult to understand. And if you looked at Bolsonaro, it looked like a PowerPoint that you would see in an evangelical's church. It was simple, it was clear, it was easy to grab onto. And there's something in that he was speaking to an audience that doesn't have people speaking to them in the way that they want to be spoken to. And so I think that, you know, whatever can be done to create political parties that are capable in a different way of engaging that sector of the population that voted for Bolsonaro, even if they're going to manifestly lose from his policies. I think that that's, just like in the United States, that's kind of the fundamental political question. And, you know, there are bits and pieces in Brazil of people who are trying to do that. But I think, especially in the middle of the crisis, I think it's gotten worse rather than better, because the panic and the lack of information and the lack of coordination, who knows what's going to happen with municipal elections this year, you know, everything's kind of in the air. So
Right.
the questioner asked for hope, and I'm afraid I have a hard time finding very much of it myself. But
Right. A lot more of uncertainty, as it were. In the face of that uncertainty, Paul Gillingham asks us to think about the future, but he says, beyond the immediate politics, there seem to be two very different possible structural outcomes when the virus passes: increased centralization, quite possibly authoritarian, or increased decentralization at both a state and barrio level. What are your thoughts on this? Brody or Rafael?
I think the decentralization is already there. I mean, that's the status quo. And so, you know, certainly at the level of the national government, I think it's teetering on the balance. And in some ways, I mean, there's been really interesting news the last couple of days about the stance of the PT vis-a-vis Bolsonaro's tenure. And there's been a lot of press with the idea that there are prominent members of the PT, including Lula, who actually want Bolsonaro to remain in power through his term because they think that that will be a better chance to set up an enduring order afterward. So there's a lot of debate even within the left about, you know, which of these visions is going to be best. But, you know, there's certainly a good chance that if quick change happens, that it would be in a more authoritarian direction. But, you know, what we have now is a complete decentralization. And the question is not so much whether that decentralization is going to present an alternative as can it be channeled in such a way that it's progressive rather than disintegrating, right?
Thanks, Brody. Rafael, would you like to respond to that?
I largely agree with Brody. I would just highlight, and going back a little bit to her previous comment, I entirely agree that, again, the neoliberal agenda has this idea that the state is a problem, right? The government is a problem, as Reagan said. And so the idea is to destroy the institutions. I mean, the universities in Brazil have been attacked very, very badly in the last couple of years. And the health system. But Brazil, and I think that's an interesting difference from the United States, right? There's so many echoes and parallels, an echo chamber, as you said, Jorge. But I think there's an important difference. Brazil has a unified public health system, SUS, right? Sistema Único de Saúde. And amidst the narrative of anti-government, anti-institutions, anti-state, anti-social policies, a lot of people were really questioning the validity and attacking SUS, which by no means is perfect, has many problems, but nonetheless is there, right? And now people are realizing many people, I would say the majority of people are realizing the importance of something like this public health system because they're counting on it and it is impacting them. So there's a little bit of sparks, right? A little bit sparks in the idea of the people going back to understanding, you know, the importance of institutions and the importance of centralized institutions or unified or federal, right? Institutions that are present throughout the country. So again, there are some sparks of hope there. There's this grassroots mobilization. So again, the centralization can be authoritarian, but it can also be, you know, if it's well framed and well implemented, right? Something that is important and is valid for people. So I think we are right there in that situation where it's almost, it's a situation where a lot can come out of it, bad and good, right? On the federalization, on the decentralization, right? Those two movements don't have necessarily to be by themselves are positive or negative. It depends of what is being pursued in a decentralized fashion, what's being pursued in a federal system. Brazil is a much more elements of authoritarianism are much more present in Brazil political narrative, in political debate, and in the state of Brazil today than 10 years ago. A lot of people are realizing, that, and people being concerned about that, and which is again the beginning of a process to find an alternative and to respond to that situation. But again, we are really in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the hurricane, right? And it's very hard to see what is going to have more weight and what's going to lead to what, right? It depends. Again, I'm going to highlight once again. It depends on what is done by people today. So if more progressive forces and more at least democratic forces now are more active, and they're trying to establish conversations and actually doing things such as at the governor's level, at the grassroots level. It shows the vitality of the Brazilian society and a little bit even of the political groups and elites. But we don't know. We don't know if it's going to be enough. We really have to see and act.
Thank you, Rafael. We've got a question, and we're going to start winding down. Maybe one question beyond this. Are the most from Daniel Trielli? Are the most recent overtures of Bolsonaro to the old political elite, Central, going to be his undoing? Will he be able to restructure his government, or will he lose his outsider image, which helps him with diehard supporters? Well,
again, that's the question, right? Is that going to be the survival mechanism that are going to keep Bolsonaro in power or not? We don't know. If I were to bet, right, I think Centrão may provide a lifeline to Bolsonaro rather than to. Will he lose supporters in the anti-establishment people that elected him because he was the new guy, would not act in the old political way of negotiating in Congress through, giving money to them to vote in support of the federal government? Yes, he already lost some support, and a lot of people are going to now migrate to Moro anti-Bolsonaro, fight that has been established in the last few days. But again, we need to remember what happened with the previous president. Before Bolsonaro, we had Temer in power, who came down to have approval ratings in the polls in Brazil of 4%, right? And who was mired in political scandals of greater magnitude in terms of the corruption and the money involved than Bolsonaro. I mean, Bolsonaro has very, serious crimes, accusations in the Bolsonaro family of, mafia-like actions and militia and even assassinations. But Temer was mired in corruption scandals in the billions of dollars. And Temer was able to finish his term in power because he was a skillful politician who managed in the Congress, to not allow impeachment proceedings to take place. Again, Bolsonaro is not nearly as skillful, but if he gives enough to Centrão, which is this old guard politicians who really know how to negotiate things in Congress, I'm not expecting impeachment proceedings to start anytime soon, or if they start, which they may, to succeed. But again, it's a guess.
Brody, would you like to speak to that? Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that, except for the fact that the Centrão was already there in the original coalition, and so the movement right now is actually sort of a reorganization of his relationship with the Centrão rather than anything new, because, both including Paulo Guedes and including Moro himself was in a way, Moro partly appeals to people who, like the kind of outsider cowboy image of how you do politics, but he was also somebody that that had an enormous amount of faith from people who usually would have been from that Tucano center, that. So I think it's just they're negotiating now to see what concessions they can get out of him and in exchange for their support, because they're about all he's got left. And I don't know, I'm not sure whether, I don't think it would really change the mind of diehard supporters. One thing that we haven't brought up is that this changing in the leadership of the federal police is a really big deal in terms of politics, because what it indicates is Bolsonaro going to a new level in terms of trying to reorganize the state under the surface. And so this was in reaction to a couple of investigations that both involved Bolsonaro's sons, some fairly serious allegations about that trace in a weird way to the Marielle scandal, but also had to do with illegal real estate dealings on the part of Flavio and his ex-assessor. But also this whole idea of his other son, this gabinete de odio and this milicia digital, this idea of sort of spreading misinformation on purpose. There are federal investigations into both of those things, and many people think that the shakeup of the federal police last week was in reaction to that. And that parallels actually a lot of things that are happening under the surface in the Amazon. One of the questions Jorge had originally posed was about what's going on in the Amazon. The short answer is it's terrible, that deforestation has increased. Last year it increased. And the crisis is in a way serving as a cover for making it even more rapid. And so there are lots of people within the Bolsonaro administration that see this crisis as an opportunity. And the way that it's being done largely is by removing people who are in charge of the enforcement of environmental regulations and replacing them by people who generally don't have any environmental experience at all. A lot of them are military police people, actually from Sao Paulo state, from other places, and just basically gutting all of the legislation that is supposed to protect anything in the Amazon and actually in the Atlantic forest as well. And so, and that's something that the way that it applies to the question, I think, is that, you know, what we need to worry about most during this crisis and at this particular time, there's a whole question of what's going to happen to the immediate presidency and succession and what's going to happen at the center of politics. But there's also a question of who's going to take best advantage of this situation in order to push forward their needs. And certainly the center is trying to do that by negotiating. But there's also this really pretty radical part of Bolsonaro's base who are mainly agribusiness and ranching interests who are using every bit of the rope that this crisis is giving them to really accelerate, you know, things that are happening not only in terms of the environment, but also the kind of dismantling of the enforcement capacity of the state. And if that goes too far, it's actually going to be really difficult to pull it back later. And so, you know, for people who are watching this situation and where the action is, I think that that's one place to really keep your eye in the following months about what happens in that situation.
Thanks so much for that, Bertie. In fact, I was going to ask the question about ecology that we had talked about before, but I am still so struck by, you know, as you're speaking, we could plug in US, right, into the times that you mentioned Brazil, particularly around the ecology and the kind of undermining of, you know, the mechanisms at the level of a state, right, to protect them, and also, you know, the blatant land grab, right? That's going on, resource grab. I wanted to ask, right, because you brought it up, and we can end on this, about this ecological disaster that's going on. The Wall Street Journal last week, you know, talked about how horrendous the situation is at the moment, and there's lots of numbers for this, I'm sure you're familiar with. I wanted to ask on the other side, what are the responses on ecology? What's the activism like? I know that indigenous communities have historically been involved in this and are so as well now. I wanted you to give us some more dimension on this. And Rafael, Brody, either one of you who wants to jump in.
Sure.
You can start, Brody.
Great.
So I had one thing in particular. So as Jorge says, there's been a lot of activity on the part of particularly indigenous activists who have already been feeling like they were under real threat before the COVID-19 erupted. And now there really is this feeling that this disease is being brought in on top of, you know, many, many months of unleashed violence that has really destroyed a lot of communities and a lot of lands that are supposed to be reserved. So there's been a lot of activism there. There's been a lot of international outcry, but the figures, and I'll just share the screen quickly so you can see, the figures are just extraordinary for the last couple of years. And so this is the general deforestation map for the states that are most affected by deforestation. And you see that this one, Pará in particular, is a really strong upward trend. If you put it into numbers, I think that it was a 51% greater rate of forestation from January to March than it was a year ago even. And last year, 2019, was a 30% increase on the year before in terms of deforestation. So these things are just going gangbangers. The images are horrific. If you just look at the next one of these on here, this is in Roraima, but you can find similar pictures from just about anywhere. And in terms of hope, there is this activism on the part of indigenous people, this international outcry because of things like this, but there's also a judicial angle to this. And so there's something called the Força Tarefa Amazônia, which was started in 2016 and as an idea, and then really came into place in 2018, right before Bolsonaro came in. And they are one of the few agencies that's really able to kind of do something in an active way to try to call for more enforcement, to try to call for the persecution of crimes ambientais. And they've been pretty active. There's been a lot of news about their attempts to kind of use the mechanisms of the judiciary to meet this challenge. It's through the prosecutor's office at the federal level. So that's a kind of activism that could end up having some power, but that again goes back into this question of whether or not it's going to be dismantled so that it's not able to fulfill that function. And I think that's a really big question going forward. And the short-term answer is that despite all of these forms of activism, all of the indications are that this stuff is accelerating rather than slowing down during the crisis.
Thanks, Brody. Rafael, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. Just one note. This week, so amidst everything, amidst Bolsonaro going into the streets and shaking hands with people, and he likely has tested positive for COVID. We'll see if he's mandated to review his tests. So amidst all this, amidst all the murders and mass graves and the destruction of the institutional capacity, for not even progressive, for the regular, what's expected of a federal government in a country as big as Brazil, as complex as Brazil, right? Continues. The dismantling and destruction continues. And there's a little bit of this idea that crisis is an opportunity for some of these forces to actually implement their agenda. So this week, the National Foundation of the indigenous groups in Brazil, FUNAI, passed a directive that authorizes, right? Because in a lot of places, especially in the Amazon, some lands that indigenous groups claim that belongs to them should belong to them because historically presence in that place. Some of these demarcations and the official grants and legal rights to that land takes forever in the judiciary process, in the whole state process of granting those things. So in the situation of the lands and reserves and protected areas that have not finalized that process, there's no directive of this national service of indigenous groups allows people, and there's a conflict between people that invade these lands, private and non-indigenous groups that have farms in this what should be protected land of the indigenous groups. This directive gives them the right to sell the lands to third parties, which of course would make it even harder, right, for the official final granting of the lands to the indigenous groups. So I highlight again this, what Brody, had so eloquently indicated before, right? The destructions of the state capacities, and quite honestly, the destruction of rights of people is ongoing. It continues to take place. But again, let's remember, indigenous groups in Brazil, and this is something that they mention, they remind us all the time. We've been fighting this for 520 years, and we're still here. So they're very mobilized, they are very active, they are very visible. They have support throughout Brazilian society and throughout the world. They continue to try to speak out about these things. So let's become more aware of what they're doing and to help them, vocalizing these things, because this is still to be played, right? We're still in the process of trying to do something about this. As the title of the book you mentioned, Jorge, it's Risks and Resistances, right? So that's where we are.
Thank you so much, Rafael and Brody, and thank you so much for doing, your own part and making us more aware. This has been really wonderful. I can't think of two people I'd rather speak about Brazil with than you. I want to just quickly do a plug. Next Wednesday, Latin American and Caribbean Studies at noon, we'll have Ana Arjona from our Department of Political Science presenting on her research in our faculty colloquium. Thank you again. Please look at our chat there, and you can see information about signing up for our events and getting all sorts of stuff mailed. And now, let me thank Danny Posto and Cindy Pingree again for managing all of this, and our guests again. Thank you so much for doing this.